Okay, lecture notes part 2 for the Greeks. So here we go. Part 2. Okay, so in chapter 2 we're mostly going to talk about wars and conflicts that go on with the Greeks. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Persian Wars. Um, the Persian Empire is the largest empire in this time period, and there's a little tiny city-state of Onia that revolts against the Persian Empire, and they're going to get support from the Athenians, um, because the Athenians obviously want to do a lot of trade with them, and so the Persian Empire can't allow this to happen because it would obviously look really bad. So they go and they obviously the Persians go against the Greeks in both 493 and in 490. And again, the Persians win a couple battles, and then of course the Greeks win a couple battles, and then of course the Greeks basically kind of kick out the Persians for a while, and then Darius' successor Xerxes comes in, and as we've already mentioned in class, some battles that go along with that, but essentially Xerxes does get to Athens. Population is gone, and he basically burns Athens to the ground. And almost immediately he kind of regrets his decision to burn it to the ground. But Athens is nevertheless burned to the ground, and he is, of course, driven out of Athens later on. So the Athenians and the Greeks and the Spartans and all the other city-states kind of band together to fight the Persians, and they kick out the Persians, and obviously our world would be quite different if the Persians had won. So what comes out of the Persian Wars is that the city-states realize that they need to kind of band together in times of need. And so one of the things that the Athenians do is they create this Delian League, and the Delian League is created to forestall any more attacks by the Persians, and it's led by, like I mentioned, the Athenians. But in order for this Delian League to work the way the Athenians want them, massive amounts of payments go into Athens to build a big, huge, strong navy, and a lot of that wealth that is given to the Athenians for building up a strong navy also kind of creeps into city projects and people's pockets and makes Athens really, really wealthy. And the Delian League, other city states are kind of going, well, wait a minute, what do we kind of really get out of this deal? So from their perspective, it doesn't work out as well as they would have hoped. And so a lot of the polises resent Athens and Athens' ability to kind of command everything from afar and get them to, force them to make all these payments. And then, of course, they go and watch what's happening in Athens, and they realize, hey, maybe our money isn't quite going to what it's supposed to go to. Okay, so you have this conflict between Athens and Sparta, kind of over these issues and others, and it's called the Peloponnesian War. So it's basically a civil war between two city-states. You've got Athens on one side and their group, and you got the Spartans on the other side and their group. And who wins this war? It's Sparta, and Athens is forced to surrender, and Athens has to destroy their city walls, which makes them extremely vulnerable to any of the other armies or any other group that's going to come after the Spartans. But then the Spartans, of course, have to deal with other policies that obviously still support the Athenians. So you got this Peloponnesian War that's going to last roughly about 26 years. So here's kind of a map that kind of illustrates um, illustrates the Peloponnesian War. As you can see, you've got the Athenian campaign and the Spartan campaign. The Athenian campaign is mostly on water. The Spartan campaign is mostly on land. So you've got naval battles, you've got land battles, you've got obviously people supporting the Athenians, which is primarily along the coast of Turkey and along the Aegean Sea. The Spartan Confederation is mostly on land. So, you've got battles going on everywhere, not just in what would be considered Greece today, but, in other parts like Turkey, Sicily, for example. And so, there's a lot going on here. It's not just a small, isolated, fighting between these city-states. All right. So, what comes out of all this? Well, you've got a weakened political system in Greece, or the Greek city-states, and you've got the small little um, city-state / province up in the northern part. It's kind of, most people think it's kind of a little backwards, known as Macedon. It's kind of in the northern region, and the guy who kind of runs this is a guy by the name of King Philip, and he builds this massive military complex during this time period, or a little bit after this time period. And in 350 BC, he encroaches on Greek city-states, policies to the south, and within a very short time, give or take 15, 20 years, he controls these regions as well. So, out of the vacuum of the Peloponnesian War, you've got smaller areas that really nobody pays too much attention to, that are able to form large armies and basically take over all this area. So why is that important? Well, Philip II is pretty important, but it's his son, Alexander, that's obviously the most important person here. And of course, there isn't too many people in history to get the name great behind them. Alexander's one of them. And for a lot of different reasons. But he rapidly expands throughout the Mediterranean basin. He is a genius. He's a military genius. He's narcissistic. He's full of himself. He's youthful. He's energetic. He's inspiring. He might be. Some people might think of him as being a little bit of a psychopath. He's driven, but he also, in a lot of ways, idolizes the Persians, even though he wants to conquer them. I mean, don't get me wrong. He does want to take over Prussia, but in a weird sort of way, he idolizes the enemy. He finds them fascinating, and he finds them to be, they're kind of like, the big kid on the block, and he's like the little kid. And he kind of idolizes the big kid, even though he still wants to kind of knock him down. So he invades Persia, and he's successful in Persia, and he continues to go on into India. But at that point, his soldiers are so tired of fighting, and they just want to kind of go home or go to the local bars and have a drink or go off and get married. They just want to do something else. Okay, but he pretty much exhausts his troops almost to the point of mutiny. And at that point, he kind of realizes, okay, I think it's kind of time to stop conquering and start nation building or empire building. All right, so here's Alexander's empire. As you can see, it's most of modern-day Greece, Turkey, Iraq, Iran, parts of Persia, and Egypt. And of course, you can see where the line is. He's kind of all in this Middle Eastern location. So, he gets to a point where he's going, okay, I'm not gonna, you know, I gotta kind of rule this empire. Unfortunately for um, us, I guess he falls ill and dies mysteriously. Not exactly sure how, poisoned, or he drinks so much that he becomes sick, and we're not exactly sure how he dies because there's no tomb for him, there's no body, we haven't found any of that stuff, but we do know that after he dies, his generals kind of divide up his empire, and so you have the Antonius takes Greece and Macedon, um, which is ironic because most people would have. He takes the smallest part, and most of the generals kind of laugh at him for taking it or being chosen to take in this part, or he got this part, however you want to look at it. But for us in Western society, it's a good thing because he's going to hold Greece together for quite a long time until the Romans take over. But of course, the Romans are going to idolize the Greeks, so the Greeks are going to copy and paste basically, or the Romans are going to copy and paste from the Greeks, and of course that's a good thing for us. You have the Ptolemy in Egypt, and they're basically going to rule until the Romans take them over, and then the Seleucus Empire is going to form as well. That's the largest part, but I think of the three, it's the one that lasts the least. Um, so you have economic integration of this Hellenistic empire that Alexander the Great forms. You've got what's called intellectual cross fertilization. So you've got a lot of trade going on. You've got a lot of ideas going back and forth. You've got this mixing of Greek philosophy and culture with Greek or Persian philosophy, I should say, and it's just kind of all kind of blended together, and it makes for what's known as the Hellenistic period. Um, and so it's kind of a fascinating time period in world history where you have the blending of these two cultures and traditions. So, um, like I said, you've got the Antigonid Empire, smallest of the Hellenistic empires, local descent. They don't, obviously the city states want their independence back, but you have issues of land distribution and heavy colonization activity, which of course would also mean going into modern day Italy. All right, you also got the Ptolemaic Empire. It's the wealthiest of the group because of Egypt. It establishes state monopolies on textiles, salt, and beer. Its capital is Alexandria, of course, named after Alexander the Great. Um, it's where you have the major museums and the major library, and you have what's known as the Alexandria Library that forms there. And it's going to remain an important port city um, pretty much all the way up until fairly modern time period. Um, Now you may be thinking, okay, why tax salt and beer? Guy, remember salt is the only rock that I know that we eat. You need salt to survive, and so it's heavily taxed because people need it to survive. They also use it as a preservative. Um, and you're thinking, okay, why beer? Um, you got to remember during this time period, most people didn't trust water and they didn't know how to purify water, but they knew that beer was fermented and purified through the process of making beer, so it was safe to drink. So that's why you have a tax on those two items, and of course textiles because people need clothing. Otherwise, we all run around, without clothes on. So they heavily monopolize those things. The Seleucid Empire, a massive colonization of Greeks, export of Greek culture, value as far east as India. Um, and then you have, again, trade in these areas. And of course, Ahsoka, which we met in The ancient India chapter legislates in Greek and Aramaic, and of course the language of India as well. So you have Greek in influencing parts of India, and we know that it's in there because we found coins and architecture that's similar to the Greeks and writing that's similar to the Greeks and so on. So that's pretty much my lecture on wars and Alexander the Great and um, him taking over and the Peloponnesian War. So if you have any questions, please let me know in class. Thanks for listening.